Legacy of Kain is a series that has been criminally overlooked for far too long. In the modern day, when classic video games are being revived left and right, when remasters and remakes are more common than ever, no series deserves this treatment more than Legacy of Kain. Not only because Legacy of Kain is one of the most unique and interesting video game series to ever exist, but also because the series has been neglected for such a long time. Thankfully, I can say that this time I speak of is officially over with the release of Soul Reaver 1 and 2 Remastered. Soul Reaver 1 and 2 in particular had terrible original PC ports, and the first one was so rough that the game was pulled from Steam. This remaster seeks to replace those versions of the games while providing an experience that's as close to the original as possible. And I think that for the most part, this remaster does that. And not only does it provide an authentic Soul Reaver experience, it includes a ton of extras for fans of the series. While I don't think the new designs are perfect, I think they tend to nail the series' aesthetic, and including the option to switch to the OG designs allows the player to play whatever version they would like to. This will be more of a loose form review than I normally do, but today I'd like to talk about my first impressions of this remaster and how I felt about it overall. It's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Soul Reaver 1 and 2 Remastered. For some context, if you aren't aware, the Soul Reaver games are a part of a larger series called Legacy of Kain. The Legacy of Kain consists of Blood Omen, Blood Omen 2, Soul Reaver 2, Legacy of Kain Defiance, and the now defunct online game, Nosgoth. The last attention the series saw was when an attempt at making a new game in the series titled Dead Sun was cancelled. Since then, the series has mostly been on a hiatus. The rights to the IP were passed around, and these games weren't exactly accessible. Most of the games had to be emulated or patched because their modern platform versions were pretty rough. But on the 25th anniversary of the release of Soul Reaver, a remastered collection of both Soul Reaver games was announced. Remasters are a strange thing because they are the de facto middle ground between a straight port and a full-on remake. There's a lot of room in that middle ground, and sometimes remasters can be far closer to ports, and sometimes they can be closer to remakes. But the biggest question that most people have about remasters is usually, what's changed? The short answer to this is a lot and a little. First, both games have had quite the graphical overhaul. With a fresh coat of paint and a few touch-ups, Soul Reaver is looking better than ever. Both games have basically had their fidelity increased a ton. The environments have mostly stayed the same structurally, but their textures have been scaled up a bit. In most cases, they look nearly identical to their original counterparts, and I think overall the environments managed to retain a lot of their original charm. It's mostly little details that stuck in my mind even when I was a kid, the first time I played these games, like the way that the green water bleeds onto the stone around it at the beginning of the game. There's obviously something that's going to be lost when you're fast forwarding a game 25 years into the future, but I think they generally got it right. A lot of the hard edges have been removed for better or for worse. Raziel in particular doesn't look as skinny or as gangly, but I do like his new arm wrappings. It's a give and a take overall, but there are a lot of things that I actually think work better in this version of the game. For example, Ariel's new design looks fantastic, and I actually prefer it to the original. The original Soul Reaver was kind of flat across the board, possibly because a lot of the game was painted on textures, and that's fine. It wasn't a downside, it gave the game a particular look and a feeling, but the remasters show what happens if these pieces of art were pulled out of their surfaces and further brought to life. In general, it's not identical to the original game, let's call it a new flavor, but I think that flavor is really good, and in general it just looks great. Some things have been redesigned and changed a little bit, but I genuinely think it keeps the aesthetic, the design, and the style of the original game without sacrificing too much. The only thing I would say is I'm not a huge fan of Kain's design in the remaster, but this is localized to just the first game. I think that Kain's original animations were already a bit goofy, but worked because of the PS1 graphics at the time. I think bringing his character into high definition really just makes him look a bit dorky and less imposing, and like most of the problems I have with the redesigns or style changes, this is just a nitpick, because at the end of the day, if you do prefer the original style of graphics, you can change back to those at any time, and this game will just function as the originals if they were properly ported to modern systems. You have it your way, if you will. And the most impressive thing about this is that we can do this at any time with the click of a button. Pressing in R3 at any time will switch the graphics to the OG models or the new ones. It's insane how quickly and how easily you can do this just to check if something's been changed, by how much, or what it looked like before. You can even do this within cutscenes, which is just crazy to me. It's just such a great feature, and I think all remasters should have this. In the current landscape, this is absolutely going the extra mile and feels like the team trying to please as many audiences as possible. They want to cater to the classic fans that might not want the look of the original game disturbed, and also the people who haven't played these games and want an experience that looks a bit more fresh. It really is the best of both worlds. The game also now has a day and night cycle, something that was included in the original alpha versions of Soul Reaver, but was eventually cut from the final product. Something this new remaster excels at is lighting in general, and areas will look completely different when bathed in shadow or sun. Even just the torches and lamps throughout the game do a lot of heavy lifting to create a nice ambiance for this classic title. Much of the gameplay in both of these games has stayed the same though. In the first game, we're playing Raziel, a vampire that was cast into the Lake of the Dead and rebirthed as some strange new beast. We gather power over time, seeking out Cain, Raziel's former master who betrayed him. We fight vampires, dueling them up close until they're weak enough to finish them off with some method that kills them: sunlight, impalement, or fire. We spectral shift into another realm to make our way about the world and fight just as many enemies there in the form of spirits. And most importantly, we reave many souls and move a ton of blocks by hand. Soul Reaver 2 sees Raziel extending his journey, this time across time instead of just space. He fights for survival in many different realms, battling against humans, strange beasts, and spirits, while upgrading his Reaver over the course of the game. We move many less blocks in this game, but solve just as many interesting puzzles. Both games are just about identical to their original counterparts in terms of substance. Everything functions well, no changes and no downgrades to the combat or controls, it just works. This is the best lane to inhabit for a remaster, as close to the original as possible, in my opinion. There have been a few additions in terms of gameplay, and though slight, I do think they make good inclusions for this collection. In Soul Reaver 1, we now have a compass to keep our orientation in the world. I don't really feel like this is very necessary, but it does match the game's aesthetic to the second one, which had a compass on release. Possibly the biggest addition to the remaster is that of the interaction indicator. This is a small indicator that pops up on items that we can interact with. It'll appear on doors, switches, weapons, puzzle blocks, anything that we can get our grubby little hands, cloven hands, onto. I would normally not be in favor of a change like this, and yet again, this change can be easily turned off in the menus if it isn't your sort of thing. But I actually liked having it. I found that it made the game a lot more clear, and sure, it does break immersion a bit, but it was just a really nice inclusion overall to both entries. The remaster also includes an overworld map for Soul Reaver 1 that allows you to see the different areas that you can traverse, and has a handy little checklist at the bottom that tells you how many secrets you have left to collect in each area. It's another inclusion that's just great for new players or returning ones looking to experience the game in a new way. The entire game can obviously be interfaced with without using the map, just like the original, so it isn't necessary, but it is a nice touch. And this seems to be a theme for the few additions that the remasters do include. They are subtle changes that are made in the interest of accessibility and quality of life, but the intention always seems to be not to go overboard, towing that line by providing new features, but not ruining the original experience. You can tell that the team thought about these things and had these discussions, how to improve but not alter. A neat addition that isn't really that noteworthy are just the achievements. The fact that both Soul Reaver games now have achievements is just a really nice thing to have. Obviously, this won't make sense if you haven't been a fan of the series for a long time, because why wouldn't a remaster include achievements? But it's just nice that we're living in a time where you can try and hunt for all the trophies in Soul Reaver 1 and 2. The performance of the remasters is something that I don't have a ton to say about. Both games perform very well with high frame rates in the mid 100s. I never really got frame drops at any point through either of my two playthroughs. There were a few small glitches that I encountered here and there. Most of them were visual and not really worth worrying about though. A couple texture glitches, nothing all that serious. I did encounter one bug that seemed to plague the second half of my playthrough of the first Soul Reaver game though. Alt-tabbing out of the game seemed to cause my sound effects to glitch and all queue up to be played about 60 seconds later. It would then glitch all of the sound effects in the game until I restarted it. This was pretty annoying, but the issue seems to have been solved now because I did not experience this on my second playthrough of the first game. As an overall, both Soul Reaver remasters are very good. They capture the spirit of the original while bringing these games up to modern visual standards, and they act as a crisp, clear drink of water in the desert that is the Legacy of Kain medium right now. But the part of this game that really impresses is just how they go above and beyond what is expected of a remaster. There's a bonus content section of the launcher for these games that I would highly recommend checking out. There's a ton of stuff here in general. First, there's a gallery with fan art, cosplay, and a ton of concept art that seems unreleased. There's a music player where we can listen to tracks from the OST, a lore reader that provides some context to the world and the locations we visit, and the Dark Chronicle that provides full scripts for both Soul Reaver 1 and 2. There's also the outtakes that were included in the PS2 release of Soul Reaver 2. But the most interesting thing here is by far the lost levels. If you aren't aware, the original Soul Reaver had a ton of cut content. There was a huge amount planned for that game that just ultimately couldn't make it into the finished product. Multiple bosses, multiple areas, sequences, weapons, and monsters. The game was supposed to be much larger than it actually was, and many people have done a lot of work trying to restore or document this content over the years. One person that's been bastioning this cause has been Ben Lincoln. I interviewed Lincoln back when I originally covered the Legacy of Kain series, and he seems to have worked on the game to restore some of this lost content, and even has a message in the menus. This message details how long Lincoln has been working on finding this lost content, and how Crystal Dynamics offered some of their archives never before seen. In the remaster, we can explore 4 different levels through the bonus content section of the game: the Undercity, the Smokestack, the Retreat, and the Forges. These levels only have a few enemies, they don't have any ability to interact with them, they just exist as museums that we can walk around in. Regardless though, this is amazing from both a preservation view and just the series overall. These levels were thought to be completely gone, but here they are, basically restored. And this speaks to what I was talking about before, that the effort and labor that has gone into this remaster is so impressive to me. This isn't just a cheap cash grab that was put out on the market to make some extra money from an old IP. This is a genuine project that will appeal to both new and old fans of the series. It all comes back to the fact that none of this effort was mandatory. They didn't need to include the lost levels, or the lore pages, or a new map, or the ability to swap new and old graphics. None of this was required, but the team in charge of this has gone above and beyond to try and make something worthy of this legendary series. And this all comes back to the state of the series in general. For a long time, Legacy of Kain has been in a limbo state, a place where it doesn't really seem like much is happening. No news on new projects, no word on remakes or remasters or sequels, or really any attempt at reviving it. And in previous years, ports were being removed and access to these games was being revoked. It was getting harder and harder to be able to revisit the Legacy of Kain in its entirety. But this year as a whole has been a fantastic one for the series. Before the announcement of the Soul Reaver Remasters, a graphic novel prequel to the games was announced, The Dead Shall Rise. A Kickstarter was launched for the project, and a fund that was asking for less than $100,000 ended up raising $1.4 million. The fans clearly spoke with their money and showed that they cared, that there is an audience for this series to return to, and now we have Soul Reaver back on modern platforms. At this point, you can play Soul Reaver 1 and 2 on modern systems, as well as Blood Omen 1 and 2, which are both available on the PlayStation Store at this point. The only game that hasn't gotten much love has been Defiance, but luckily there's still a somewhat serviceable PC port of the game available on Steam. But overall, I say all of this to mean that Legacy of Kain has had a fantastic year, and this year ends with a great remaster of Soul Reaver, a remaster that is worked on by genuine fans of the series, not to mention the fact that notorious Legacy of Kain advocate Raina Audrin worked on this project as well. This remaster is a reflection of the love and care and attention that people have put into the series over the years, and I genuinely recommend that you check it out if you've loved these games at any point before. If you've never experienced them, then this is the perfect entry point. And revisiting these games for the first time in a few years, I can't even express how well they hold up. The writing and voice acting is just as fantastic as when these games first released. They of course have their downsides, like some clunky combat and some longer than necessary sections. If you're interested in hearing me talk about the entire series, you can go watch my video on it now. But Soul Reaver 1 and 2 are such great games, with unique characters, great storylines, and a genuinely ambitious world. It made me realize how games like this aren't really being made today. We haven't seen anything as truly novel as Legacy of Kain in a very long time, which probably makes the best case for giving the series a second look. But I really think this remaster is probably a test. It's a test to see how viable Legacy of Kain is as a series moving forward. The people in charge of the IP want to know if these games can still be profitable. And the only way that they'll get that message is if these remasters sell well. So I think this remaster spells good tidings for the series moving forward. Legacy of Kain is a series that I owe a great debt to. It was the first full series that I covered on this channel and was the video that was probably responsible for even making this channel possible in the first place. It's a series that I'll never be able to forget about, not for the rest of my life. These games mean a lot to me, and when I released my video on the Legacy of Kain series 3 years ago, I ended it by using a line from the games to illustrate the fact that I still held hope for this series returning. And these remasters have renewed a similar optimism as a fan of the Legacy of Kain series. And last time I was thanking the Legacy of Kain community for keeping this series alive. This time, I'd like to direct that same sentiment towards the people working to make more projects in these worlds. I'd like to thank them for the first bitter taste of that terrible illusion: hope.